This man was searching for his missing sister. I was that man. When I finally found the mouth of the cave after months of walking the same slope, I didn't find what anyone back home expected. I found her, sure. But I also found him. A living thing the world calls Bigfoot, sitting by a small fire with my sister on a log that smelled of smoke and moss. People in town still say my name like it's a weather report. Lester. I used to run the county sawmill machines, fix pickups, keep the road graders in shape. I know the sound a bearing makes before it goes out. I know the way a diesel coughs when a plug is just barely gone. I learned to read the land for the same reasons I learned to read a man's hands. Work keeps you honest. When Maggie left, she didn't leave with the fanfare you see in movies. She folded herself up into a pack, took the edge of town road past the school, and disappeared into the Cascades the way a gull vanishes over the ocean. This was 1989. We still had a rotary at Mom's kitchen and a phone line that answered to the whole county. Search crews used lanterns and Vasquez's mutt and radios that cut in and out when the weather shifted. There were flyers stapled to every telephone pole, coffee shop shelf, and church bulletin board from Buckley to the edge of town. But the first week is always the loudest part. The sheriff presses his jaw together. The newspapers print the same photograph until the edges blur, and people say the things they think will comfort. She'll turn up. Town kids have wandered off before. After a while, that noise thins. The sheriff calls off the big searches. The dogs lose the scent. The town goes back to work. But I couldn't go back to work. I could wrench a wheel, but I couldn't get the image of Maggie out of my head. The last clear one I had before her disappearing was of her on the porch in that thin flannel, hair scraped into a messy knot, telling me she was going out to find the creek again. She had been restless for a while. She kept books about river mapping and old logging trails. We'd argued, heated, as siblings do, about her leaving for longer trips, about responsibility, about Mom. We hadn't spoken properly in a month. That argument tasted like fried onions and stiff silence. When she didn't come back, that silence turned into a fist I couldn't unclench. They told me there was nothing left for me to do. The sheriff, Tom Brennan, put it kindly enough. Lester, we've combed the ridge. We followed the old fire break. We had everyone out there for a week. He said it with the authority of someone who knew when to draw a line, partly to protect the town from hope, partly to protect the people still living there from wasting their lives on ghosts. But I couldn't accept the finality in the way he closed the folder and smoothed the photograph, so I kept walking. At first it was sensible. Retrace steps, check old waypoints, listen for signs dogs might miss. I learned to read things others didn't notice. Small markers on moss that meant someone had passed through. A snapped twig here, a scrap of foil caught in a root there. I started carrying notebooks, the kind men punch holes in and keep in the glove box. On my first solo walk after the call-off, I sat on a log and drew a map the way old miners used to tally veins. Creek runs, alder stands, granite outcrops. I wrote down times. I wrote down what I ate. I marked where the light fell differently through certain maples. On the fourth week, my boss, Frank Yates, noticed I wasn't showing up for morning shifts. He came by the trailer where I slept, all rims and oil on his palms, and said, "Lester, you taking another day? We've got a mountain of overtime. The boys look to you." He didn't say it in an accusing way. Men who work together keep each other's accounts simple. I told him I had things under control, that I was doing some side work, and he left it at that. A couple of the younger guys joked that I must have fallen in with the mountain folk, living off trout and berries. I didn't say anything. You don't explain grief with jokes. You don't explain obsession. There were other small-town rituals around missing people, candle vigils at the high school, a prayer meeting at the Methodist church, a story or two that turned the missing into a myth overnight. Maggie seen on the lake at dawn, Maggie singing with an old man down by the boat launch. A woman named Eleanor who ran the diner, kept a box of leftover flyers behind the counter, and whenever I came in she'd slide me a fresh one with sugar clinging to the corner. "Keep the coffee on," she'd say. "Don't go soft on this." Her kindness was the loosened thread at the hem of things. It was all that, plus the way the town's eyes found me like a map. They watched, then looked away. What kept me going weren't the big searches. It was the small signs. traces that irritated my attention until I had to follow them. People leave marks on the land without thinking, cairns stacked as trail markers by hunters, a bright piece of cloth tied to a branch as a rigging for a lost pack. I followed bird flights, deer lanes, and old logging roads. I slept with the pickup lights on, and the heater idling just a little, the way you keep a campfire so it won't go out. I got used to the creak in the trees that sounded like a half-truth, and to the way the creek would sing down below me through certain passes. If there was an order to the land, I wanted to be the kind of man who could read it. Months in, I started to notice cairns that didn't look like cairns any of us used. They were rougher, taller, stacked not where the trail would be obvious, but at odd intervals where somebody with an odd patience had stopped and spent time turning stones. At first, I thought hikers, some of the long-distance kids who liked to leave stacks to mark their passage. But these were different. They used local rock, weathered to the same silver as the creek boulders. They were purposeful. They seemed to lead, not to a trailhead or a campsite, but away from the beaten path, into the throat of the mountain where the logging roads never went. The first time I followed one, I found myself slipping down a ravine that had a smell of wet animal and smoke. I didn't tell anyone the second cairn I found was arranged like a set of hands pointing. Maybe that was my own mind making meaning out of randomness. People do that. Still, the more I walked, the more I found those stacks in places that suggested someone wanted to be found, but not in a way that would invite a crowd. It felt deliberate, like someone was making a map in stones. One evening when the autumn began to pull the color from the maple bark, I saw a line of cairns that had apparently been refreshed. Rocks placed with fresh hand smudges, moss disturbed in a way that said, "Not long ago." The sun had gone flat, and the air tasted like the metal in your mouth before rain. My flashlight beam bounced over the same mossy lichen as I kept to the slope. It struck something that glittered. A square of cloth, the kind used in old picnic baskets, knotted tight on a branch. I unclipped it with a twig, like a man undoing a bandage. The crest of the ridge opened into a cleft. It was a place you passed if you didn't intend to settle. The trail shrank into a goat path, then into nothing at all, just rock and the dark spatter of wet leaves. My breath fogged in the light beam. The cairns marched ahead like a deliberate sentence, leading me to a narrow seam in the cliff face. There was a taste in the air that wasn't just rain or dirt. It had the sweetness of burned wood and the animal musk of something that had been building a home for itself. I sat there for a long time. You learn to listen to the land, like some people learn to read sermons. I listened for more than a sound. I listened for the absence of the world outside. There were no logging trucks, no distant church bells, no dog yaps. The forest held its breath. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ribs until you cannot pretend it isn't there. My hands shook when I uncoiled the rope and lighted the lantern. The lantern had weight and a slow, practical glow, the kind that doesn't scream for attention. I used to carry one on late shifts when the mill's lights would flicker out. It steadied me in ways nothing else did. The cave mouth was narrow at first, a seam two men couldn't shoulder through at once. The path dropped, and the air grew cooler. Dampness clung to my jacket. I could see, from the way the smoke trailed and pooled, that there was a fire inside. Not a bonfire, not something that could be seen from the valley, but a careful economical flame lived in a ring of flat stones. You could tell by the way the smoke threaded up and didn't huff like a camp gone to ruin. Someone tended it. When I eased inside, the first thing I saw wasn't Maggie. It was the way a hand had left a set of tools, bruised, beetle-carved spoons, a length of rope coiled with the patience of someone folding the world into order. Whoever had been here had an eye for domesticity, for making a place livable in a way that felt soft against the hard rock. There was a mat crudely woven of cedar and bark laid near the fire, and a small pile of fish bones neatly stacked, as if they were someone's counted coins. I thought for a second that it was a trap. I thought of the kinds of people who use domestic signs to lure others, but then I heard it. A voice, low and steady, the sound of a person who had been speaking to themselves for a long time, and had finally found someone to speak to who would listen. It was Maggie's voice, but thinner, tempered by months of wind and solitude. "You shouldn't have come up here," she said. in a tone that wrapped apology and defiance into the same breath. When I stepped around a ledge, I saw her. She had those same quick hands she always did. Hands that could coax a jam jar loose or mend a needle. Her hair was longer, uncut, tangled with pine needles, but the tilt of her chin was Maggie all the way. She had a shawl. Someone had stitched it from old clothes, and she had a look I hadn't seen since she was a child, and had just broken something precious, and was waiting for me to tell her it would be okay. Relief punched through me so hard I nearly staggered. For a half moment the world was manageable. She was alive. My sister, my once arguing, headstrong sister, alive and warm by a fire. My knees wanted to fold. Words scrambled in my head like loose screws. Then something behind her moved. I saw the shoulder first, big, broad, hair dark, the way a bear's shoulder might look in the dim, but different, so different. It was crouched, not quite comfortable, but not here to threaten. It was like an old tree rooted in the cave floor. There was a hand resting on a pile of stones, the fingers long and thick, the knuckles pale under coarse hair. It wasn't the claws of a bear. It wasn't the shape that belonged to anything I had ever seen cataloged in a textbook. Still, it wasn't a thing of horror. It was a being that had put down a small wooden bowl near its feet and had arranged a stick just so. My brain, trained by years of county fairs and passing oddities on dusty highways, wanted to reduce what I was seeing to something neat. For a second I thought of a man in a costume. People had done stranger things, but this was no costume. The hair had a sheen like damp river rock. The eyes, when they turned, were not a hollow animal glare. They were deep and slow, like a lake that has been looking at itself for a long time. Maggie said the name like a prayer, and like a report. Enoch. The creature, Enoch, tilted its head, and there was an intelligence in that tilt that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It didn't speak words we would have used, not in any language I knew. It made a sound, more a sequence of low tones, almost musical. Maggie smiled then, slow and small. The kind of smile someone gives when they've found a place that will hold them. I remember everything about that moment with the clarity of a tree ring. The smell of the smoke. The way Maggie's sleeve brushed her wrist. The dull ache in my shoulder from carrying the lantern. I remember thinking a dozen things at once. Rightness and wrongness braiding each other. Because this sight was impossible, and yet it had the undeniable weight of reality. "What the hell is that?" I said. It came out sharper than I meant it to. Maggie's eyes were on me, and for the first time in months I saw a different kind of sorrow there. Not the sudden raw grief I had been nursing, but an old patient grief, the kind that has given up expecting the world to choose what you want for you. They called him a lot of things, she said. Her voice had the clinical steadiness of someone telling you facts because facts let you live with the rest. People used to tell stories about an old creature up here. We thought it was legend. I found him after the storm last winter. His cave caved in above the ridge. He was trapped. I helped him. She said it plainly. She said it like someone reading from a ledger of how she had spent the last 11 months. Helped him how? I asked. I felt ridiculous asking. She had always been the kind of person who would take a hurt thing and nurse it without thinking about the consequences. She'd done it to dogs, stray kittens, even an old neighbor who'd lost his bearings. Compassion was both her compass and her stubbornness. Pulled at the rubble, she said. Brought water down the way I could. I sewed his wounds. He could only grunt at first. Later he learned to follow my hands. He watches me the way you watch the river. Her fingers traced a line in the dirt like she was drawing a map. He saved me too, Lester. When the falls took my pack last spring, he was there. He kept me alive. I noticed then the small domestic things arranged with a deliberate hand. Bundles of gathered roots, a carefully patched coat that must have been his if that was a coat, and a set of worn objects that suggested a long making of life. Beads for a string, flint for sparks, a flattened stone used as a plate. It wasn't a life of savagery. It was the kind of rough order folks in our town might make if they were taking up residence in an old barn. Practical, tidy, a little stubbornly beautiful. You could have come back, I said, voice flat. The pile of months crashed into my chest. You left, you just... I didn't finish. Things left unsaid, hung like tools in a shed, heavy and dumb with use. "I couldn't," she said. There wasn't defensiveness in it. There was only fact. They'd have dragged him out and sold him to the highest bidder. Or they'd have put him in a place with cold lights and glass. He wouldn't have lasted the corridors and the exams. He never would have meant anything to them except for what he was on a contract form. She looked at me like I was still the brother who scraped knees and carried home mail. "I can be here," she said. He needed someone who could move slow and do the small things. Maggie making a tea and cleaning a wound. That's something I learned. That's all I know how to do. The lantern stuck to the ceiling of my skull for a moment and made everything trumpets and immediate. A part of me wanted to drag her out of there, to wrap her up and take her back to the sort of life where you get your teeth fixed and your hair trimmed and your neighbors bring you casseroles when you need them. Another part of me, quieter, older, understood why someone would choose the company of a creature over the company of people who couldn't see them. People had been choosing exile like that for as long as the mountains have kept secrets. "You sure he isn't going to hurt you?" I asked. It was the standard question, practical and prosaic. Maggie laughed, a small, incredulous sound. "Who says I'm a thing to be hurt?" she said. "I know what people say about him. I know the names they give. I don't think about any of that down here. He likes the way I braid my hair. He remembers the routes I show him. He likes fish. He knows when I'm sad. He doesn't know how to lie. I don't know if he's dangerous. I do know he's not cruel." And then she reached out and put her hand lightly on one of his fingers. It was an astonishingly ordinary gesture, human to whatever on earth that was, that made my throat clamp. The creature's finger was thick and calloused, with a little scar near the knuckle. When it curled, it did so without appetite. When it looked at me, it did so with quiet curiosity, not malice. I remember thinking then, if the town was right about everything, if they were the measure of what was acceptable, then Maggie had stepped outside the measure and chosen a life that would unmake her in their eyes. She'd gone from being someone you recognized to someone you didn't. The loss was not lessened by her being alive. It was reshaped. She was here, yes, a surprising answer to a prayer, but wrapped in complexities that made the answer less simple to carry home. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, because it was a truth I needed to hear. "Why keep this from me?" She looked at the floor, then up at the firelight. "Because I couldn't have explained it without you walking away," she said. "Because I thought if I told you, you'd go and take it away from him. You always did know how to fix things the way a man with a wrench fixes a car, straighten what is bent. But some things need tending, not fixing. I couldn't let them take him." Her voice had the steadiness of someone who'd made her mind up before I even knew there was a choice. She was the kind of person who will face a decision and then not look back. Sometimes that is bravery. Sometimes that is stubbornness. Often it's both. I stood there feeling like an old man on the wrong side of a story. The utility of my own life, the honest sweat of hands and the measured world I inhabited, felt suddenly narrow. The sheriff had spoken of closure. My mother had spoken of funerals. The town had spoken of moving on. Maggie had spoken of staying. And the thing behind her, Enoch, had hands that might as well have been pages from a book that nobody in town had read. I could have walked away then. I could have gone down the mountain, driven home, pretended this was a dream I had after too many nights of bad coffee and no sleep. There are men who decide at that moment to assume the shape of normalcy because normality offers a shield. I tried that for a heartbeat. The world below still spun on its axis of schedules and honking, and my name would still be called out at the mill. Instead, my feet moved forward. I sat down on an old stump by the fire because my legs wouldn't carry me any other way. The creature watched me with a gaze like a man who has always been awake before dessert. It did not approach. It honored distance with a sort of patience I'd never been taught. Maggie reached out and laid her palm on its knee like one might soothe a horse, and then she turned back to me. "Lester," she said, "you can't tell them what you saw. Not yet. Not like this." "And not tell Sheriff Brennan?" I said. That was an absurdity. Sheriff Brennan would hold a town meeting and people would swarm. The news would come. Scientists would come. Men with trucks would bring cages. People would start measuring and cataloging and making the thing into a curiosity instead of a being. I didn't have to finish the sentence for her to understand what I meant. "You know Sheriff Tom," she said quietly. "He wants to close things. He thinks he's doing right. He's a good man. But he doesn't know how to keep anything like this from being turned into a circus." She looked at me like I was a man on a scale whose weight had finally shifted. "If you blow it, Lester, they'll take it." Her fingers trembled against its fur, and something about the gesture made me feel both immensely loved and endlessly small. There are choices in life that are immediate. A rock loose beneath your foot, a hand that reaches for a burning rag. There are choices that unspool into long threads of living, decisions to keep or expose, to hold something tender and risky, or to hand it over to the light. I sat there with the lantern between us and thought of all the ways my choices had been practical. Fix the pulley, mend the fence, fix the roof. This one wasn't a repair. This was a judgment wrapped in long seasons. "How do you expect me to believe this?" I asked at last, more to test myself than her. "Being shown something that rearranged the furniture of your world doesn't make you accept it. It makes you fend for the scraps of your old life until you see which ones still fit." She smiled again. "You don't have to," she said. "Just stay, sit, look." She pushed a bowl toward me, and in the dim light I could see a meager stew, roots and fish and something wild and green. She had made it with the economy of someone who had to keep a spark alive. The creature watched us as we ate, head bowed, the slow, dignified way of an animal who has been given the courtesy of a meal. As I ate, the enormity of what I was seeing pressed against my ribs like a hand demanding an answer. All the reasons to tell the sheriff lined up like teeth. All the reasons to protect him hummed like the heart of a distant engine. I felt like a man who'd been handed both a ledger and a lie and told to decide which to keep. Later, Maggie told me things in bits and pieces, how she found Enoch after a winter avalanche, how she learned his sounds, how he followed her along a narrow shelf when she left to gather water. She told me how he had been present when she would talk to him about the kind of people who lived below the ridge. She said, simply and plainly, that he was sentient, that he had memory, and a quickness of thought and patience, and that he had been alone for longer than any of us had been alive. When she said the years, she'd heard about him from old tales, sure, but she'd also found traces. A carved totem half buried beneath moss, a woven strap that predated our roads. People had once known things differently here. The forest had been full of otherness then, perhaps before the camps and the saw lines. "Why would you come back for me?" I asked. It was the selfish part of the question that wanted the simplest answer. She reached for my hand, the way she used to when we were kids and wanted to make a fort in the pantry. "Because you are my brother," she said. "Because sometimes being lost feels like being found in the wrong place, and you don't get to decide where the right place is. Because I needed someone who would remember the town I grew out of. I knew you would." But she had not told me the whole of it. She hadn't told me what exact bind had kept her here, what the bargain was that made her choose this guarded life. She had not told me whether she had plans to return fully to town or to keep living half in and half out, like a person who lives with one boot in the water. She had not told me how she felt about being the person who held the door closed against the world. I asked the wrong question then, one born of the kind of man who measures solution by straight lines. If he lives here, doesn't that mean we have to tell somebody eventually? You can't hide him forever. Maggie looked at me, and then at Enoch, who was a presence in the corner of the cave in a way that made everything else make less noise. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe we make different rules. Maybe we find a way to live with the fact that not everything gets explained." Her answer was both infuriating and oddly consoling. It refused the neatness of the ledger. It opened a fractal of consequences I couldn't wrap my head around. But something in it warmed me like the lantern. It also made the world feel dangerously immense. That night, I lay outside the cave with the pickup jacket over me, the same jacket I'd worn to fix the generator at the mill last winter, and listened to the mountain breathe. The flame at the mouth of the cave was a small, obedient thing. The world continued in its ordinary schedule of owls and wind. I thought of the sheriff's file and the photos with Maggie's smiling face and a number stamped on them. I thought of the town that would not know how to keep a thing like Enoch dignified. I thought of the way people lined up to look at anything different, how curiosity becomes a market, and how gentle things get broken between hands. I also thought of Maggie's hands, the way she braided the hair at the nape of her neck when she was thinking. I thought of the way she had held me when we were small, and the way she had refused to come to my house when Mom's funeral had been set, how stubborn and humane our ties had always been. There is loyalty that binds you to family in ways that make the rest of the world look like a poor substitute. Sometime before dawn, I walked down the slope because the habit of industry is a kind of prayer. I didn't tell Enoch that I was leaving. I kissed Mama's picture to my lips in the darkened truck, though she wasn't there, and drove out of that part of the mountain with the radio quiet and the world half turned. The next day, inside the diner, over coffee gone cold, people smiled and called me lucky. They meant it as consolation. The sheriff stopped by and asked me to come by the station. He wanted to know who I had been with the night before. I thought about telling him, about walking up to the sheriff's desk and saying, "We found her, Sheriff. She's alive, and she's chosen a life that doesn't fit your book." But I couldn't bring myself to say it. Not there. Not in that room that smelled of disinfectant and county lines. I wanted to find a better way to say it, a way that would make him sit and understand the enormity of the consequences he would set loose. What Maggie had asked of me was not a single moment. It was a long thread. She had asked for secrecy, for patience, for complicity in something that would mark me as an outsider to anyone who learned. The town's gaze could be a warm cloak or a roping noose. That afternoon I went back with a different kind of tool. I brought a notebook not to map the mountain, but to record everything I had seen and heard, with the cautious detail of a man making a pact with his conscience. I wrote down the way the cairns were stacked, the placement of the fire, the things that suggested someone had been making a domestic life in a cave cut by old glaciers. I wrote the words she had used. I wrote Enoch's name and the way his fingers had been scarred. Writing felt like forging a record not for the town but for myself, as if by seeing the shape on paper I could better understand whether to protect it or to call it to light. That night, underneath a sky the color of old tin, I parked the truck by the old logging road and watched the line of trees for a long time. The flame upstairs threw a small promise through the cave mouth. I had a list of things to do if I chose to protect them. I could speak to someone with medicine who would understand discreet things. I could learn to make a story that would placate the sheriff. I could shape a life where Maggie could be both seen and unseen in the ways that mattered. Those were the utilitarian decisions that occupied a different part of my mind. But underneath all of that was a darker ledger. The cost of lying to friends, of being steadily estranged from a town that didn't understand my choices, of becoming a man who kept secrets like his breath. I knew that when you pick a secret up, you carry it until the seams of your life frayed. You don't know how many things you will sacrifice for the sake of sheltering something you believe needs it. I also knew what would happen if I told the sheriff. The man would do what he thought was right. He'd call in protocols, specialists, people who make their living out of rare things. Those people would measure, poke, and photograph. They would place Enoch in a room with glass that didn't breathe. The town would bring a picnic. They would want to see him eat from their hands. He would become a story for someone else, and Maggie would become a person whose choices were taken from her and written into headlines. Maggie caught me in the doorway. She held out a small, carved whistle. "For quiet," she said. "For the times when you need to call me without waking the slope." "You keep gifts for ghosts now?" I joked, though it wasn't a joke. She shrugged. "Don't tell Mom," she said, though Mom had been gone for years. Her smile was half tender and half terrible. "Promise me something, Lester." "What's that?" I asked. "Promise me you won't go and do anything you'll regret. Promise me you'll think before you act." She named it plainly. It was a plea and a boundary, a trust given under the light of a fragile thing. "Promise you won't let the town make a decision for us." I thought of the town, of Sheriff Brennan's square jaw, of people with clipboards. I thought of what it would mean to hold this quiet, what it would cost me, what it would cost Maggie, how it would carve out a life where I was partly the cunning mason of a secret. "I can't promise the future," I said, I can promise I won't do anything without thinking it through." She nodded the way a person does when they know enough about life to accept hedged promises. "That's all I ask." That night, I walked back down the logging road and parked where the pines began to thin. I sat with the truck idling, the heater warming the spaces in my bones that the night's air had tightened. The mountain seemed bigger, and my place in it smaller, and the world outside those trees less certain than it had ever been. In the months after, I would learn how to return without being seen, how to carry small things in a pocket and hand them across a gap of years. I would learn the shape of Enoch's face in the firelight and the sound his voice made when he thought he was alone. I would make friends with Dr. Sarah Chen, who would listen without pride and help without questions. I would make plans that felt like prayers and lies woven into a single cloth. I would lose people and gain a purpose that left my hands both fuller and more empty. For now, at the end of that first night, all I knew was what had happened. I had been searching for my missing sister, and I had found her alive, choosing a life that didn't fit into anyone's neat categories. And I had found him, a creature called Enoch, sitting by a fire with my sister on a mossy log. The truth of that would hang over everything I did next like weather. If this is the kind of story you want the whole of, stick around. Hit subscribe and follow. There's more to it than a man finding his sister and a monster in a cave. It gets stranger. It gets harder. It asks you to measure what you would protect and what you would expose. When I climbed back up the next morning, the cairns had been refreshed. Somebody, Maggie, Enoch, both, had tightened the stones into a trail that led not outward but deeper. The forest had an attention to it, a patience that made my heart ache. I took off my gloves and stepped carefully between the markers, because the mountain was full of old promises and new ones, and the space between them was where most of our decisions live. The cave's mouth swallowed me, and the firelight welcomed me like a neighbor who has been waiting on a porch. Maggie was sitting where she'd been, and Enoch was closer now, his silhouette a larger presence than the night before. This time, when the creature turned, it didn't merely look at me with the curiosity of an animal. Its eyes lingered as if weighing me. For a brief, strange second, it seemed to recognize the hollows that had formed in me during those months I'd wandered with a compass and a notebook. Maggie spoke before I did. "He listens," she said. "He learns. He knows the names of trees and the way the sky moves. You saw the scar on his hand. He remembers things most of us forget. He remembers rain when we forget the rhythms of how to keep it." I nodded because arguing felt useless against the gravity of what sat in front of me. "There's another thing," she said. "He understands when you bring someone a gift. He understands touch." She stood and went to the creature and pressed her forehead to its temple in a way that made my breath stop. I wasn't ready for that level of intimacy. It felt like a sacrament. It felt like the shard of something holy and precarious. I understood then that what sat in the cave was not a thing to be pulled apart and photographed. It was not something to be boxed and shown under fluorescent lights. It was a presence with habits and a way of noticing the world. It had rhythm. It had a small domesticity that looked an awful lot like dignity. Over the next weeks, I learned how slow a life could be when you had to keep it hidden. I learned Enoch's hours in the same way I learned the sawmill's shifts, by pattern and smell. He woke with the first pale light that leaked through the seam in the rock, rubbing his shoulders like a man with sore joints. He liked quiet fish, taken from a pool where the water ran cold enough to sting your hands. He would sit close to the fire with a woven pad beneath him and arrange small stones as if playing a patient, private game. When I first saw the way he bent the narrow tips of his fingers to tighten a knot, it felt like watching someone thread a needle. Such careful, ordinary work in the middle of impossibility. Enoch never made sharp noises in the cave. There was a sort of low hum he hummed to himself when he was content, and sometimes when Maggie moved around him he made a set of notes that, if I listened long enough, seemed to answer a question she had spoken with her hands. Maggie had taught him to accept small human gestures. She'd learned how to braid his matted fur at the nape of his neck, how to lay out a clean place for him to sleep, how to make a tea that didn't sting. In return, he remembered the places she pointed to on the mountainside. He remembered the trees and the way paths changed after a storm. He understood when she was sad. He would set a flat rock beside her palm and rest his hand on it, as if to say he would hold the space. It was easier to explain his presence to myself than it was to frame what to do about it. At night, under the hood of the pickup with the heater chugging in the cold, I would write lists in my notebook of everything that would happen if I told Sheriff Tom. I would write lists of everything that would happen if I stayed quiet. Both sets of lists looked ugly and practical in the same way. Consequences and lost things. Those lists did not tell me which to choose. I suppose the thing that finally moved me was a small human choice, Maggie asked. She asked me in that quiet way she always had, like a person who had done a lot of deciding and wanted to share only the part she thought someone else might hold. "I need you to keep this," she said one night, the whistle I had given her tucked into her scarf. She had a look then that made you see the ways a person could be brave and foolish in equal measure. "You know what our town does to things like this?" "You sure it's not just hiding because you're afraid?" I asked. Maybe I wanted her to confess to a plan. Maybe I wanted a simple answer. She hitched the shawl tighter and gave me the small, stubborn smile she wore when she was going to do something difficult. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm choosing. I chose. You can help me or you can stand outside and judge, Lester. I'm not asking you to be glad. I'm asking you to be steady." So I was steady. Not noble, not heroic. Just steady in the same way I had been steady when a bolt needed unseizing or a bearing needed listening to. Steady, because she had put the choice before me and asked me to hold a quiet. Steady, because I loved her in that blunt familial way that doesn't always have a softer word. The first practical help I found wasn't someone who could hide a mountain or a person. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, the new doctor at the county clinic. I'd known of her more than known her. She'd come up from the city with a scholarship and a steady face, and she had the kind of hands that could make you feel less like a problem and more like a person. I approached her because she had once treated my father for a bad bronchial, and because I had watched her treat people with a discretion that didn't come from fear, but from an ethic. I didn't go to her with a plan. I went to her with a story and a request to listen. "You're asking me to help you lie," she said the first time we met in her office, the fluorescent light making the certificates on her wall seem like promises. She said it like a statement of physics, not accusation. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm asking you to help a woman come home without the whole town tearing a life apart. You tell me which of those sounds worse. You tell me which one you would do if it was your own sister." She was quiet for a long time, and that quiet was the same kind of listening I'd learned from trees. A patient test. "What's he like?" she asked finally, because she didn't need to know whether the creature was a thing of folklore. She needed to know whether a human being, Maggie, was at risk. I told her in small ways. The hum he made, the way he set stones, the scar on his knuckle. I told her about the kindness he'd shown Maggie and the way she'd found purpose in tending to him. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't invent the kind of miraculous line that makes people on the outside weep. I just told the plain things. Dr. Chen thought about it for a long time. She asked practical questions. What Maggie needed, whether she was physically okay, whether there were wounds that needed dressing. She did not say, "This is impossible," in a way that put the burden back on me. She asked instead, what would she want? She'd want him to be safe, I said. She'd want someone to remember him as a living thing, not an exhibit. So Sarah helped. Not by hiding a creature, that would have meant something different, but by offering medical care on a private basis, and by writing careful reports that could explain Maggie's condition to anyone who asked without exposing Enoch. She examined Maggie in a quiet room midtown, where a single curtain could be drawn and no one would ask questions. She wrote a note that said things like, "disoriented from prolonged exposure," and "requires rest and follow-up." She didn't make up miracles. She didn't fix the moral knot. She just gave us a way back into town for Maggie that would not require her to hand over the things she had come to protect. There were 100 ways that could have gone wrong. Sheriff Tom could have smelled it out in an instant. A newspaper could have sniffed for a sensational line and run a story. People in town could have started whispering about Maggie's mental state, which was its own kind of violence. But we took the route that caused the least damage to the living things involved. I won't tell you we were saints. We were pragmatic and ashamed sometimes, but we tried to keep the center of the choice on Maggie and not on ourselves, We concocted a story, not a fanciful lie, but a narrative shaped to protect a truth. The stories people remember about disappearances are often simpler than the truth. Someone wandered off, someone found them, someone brought them home. We used that simple container. Maggie would walk back, shell-shocked and wet, would speak of being alone and lost and then of waking in a place she could not name. Dr. Chen would testify to a period of exposure and disorientation. We would say that she had been found by a hunter's party and brought down. We would offer no details about where she'd been, and, to the extent the town needed it, we would allow Maggie to be the center of a small rescue narrative. She'd have a place to occupy that didn't require the town to take Enoch. To some folks, that sounded like an easy way out. To others, it sounded like the only practical mercy. For me, the truth was messy. Every step in it felt like loosening the weave of my life, but we could not stand in the cave forever. Maggie could not. People needed to see her and know she was alive. They needed, perhaps, to be healed in whatever way towns were healed by closure, even if that closure was incomplete. The day Maggie came back, we staged it like a rescue that had happened somewhere along the ridge. We didn't go down the mountain like a parade. We drove in silent, took corners slow, and let the town have the tidy version of events. At the clinic, Dr. Chen ran through the basics and kept her face calm. Sheriff Tom sat in the back room and listened to the way Maggie spoke and nodded. He said the things you say when you're a man attempting to do right by your duty and your heart. He asked a few questions. We answered in ways that left holes for rumor but no route to Enoch. The town received Maggie like a slow sunrise. Eleanor gave her a cinnamon roll and a chair at the counter. People asked her to explain, and she gave small answers, about being lost, about storms, about a place that felt like home for a little while. They accepted the simple parts because it was easier than facing the complicated one. Some folks cried, some folks cheered, some folks simply patted her hand without pressing for details. I learned that week what the cost of a secret looks like in the day-to-day. Men I had worked with at the mill started to ask why I kept missing shifts. Frank Yates came by one morning and said the payroll couldn't hold together if I kept skipping. It wasn't a confrontation at first. It was a business-like fact. I told him I'd be back full-time. I lied in a way that made my stomach clench. "You're not alone up there, are you, Lester?" he asked once, eyes squinting like the wind had given him a new map. "Just looking after family," I said. He patted my shoulder the way old friends do when there's no other word to put on something. "You do right by her," he said, and then he walked away and left me in the diner with a cup of coffee gone cold. There were offers of help I had no right to accept. People wanted to drive Maggie to appointments. They wanted to sit with her at night. I had to direct that care in ways that would not expose the cave. I became the man who could answer someone's practical need with a half-truth and a steady eye. I learned how heavy lying could be when it was the kind that kept another life from being peddled at a fair. As for Sheriff Tom, he was the kind of man who loved his town like a father loved his children. He didn't always know how to protect something outside his understanding. He asked me direct questions sometimes, with the irritable patience of a man who knew what people were capable of. I would meet him over coffee and give him small updates about Maggie's recuperation while refusing certain details. He knew something was off. He said, once, "People in this county are good, Lester. We try to do right by each other. But secrets will eat a man before the mountain will." He said it like lament more than warning. It is a strange business to keep quiet in a place where people have the habit of airing everything on porches. Secrets are heavy things in small towns. They cling to you, change the way neighbors glance at you, rearrange invitations, shift schedules. I lost dinners with neighbors who started to think I was odd. I lost the easy camaraderie at the mill. I gained in exchange late-night driving and furtive trips up the ridge while the town slept. I would return with my pockets filled with things, handmade fish hooks, a carved bead, dry tea wrapped in cedar, and I would tell myself those were small prices. There were tense moments that tested whether we could keep our compact. Once, a couple of hunters came up the ridge looking for a place to camp. They had maps and a sort of blunt curiosity. One of them, a young man with a laugh like gravel, found a fresh cairn and remarked on it. "Who builds these?" he asked aloud, half to himself, half to the air. "We spoke to them the way you do when you don't want a fire to start. casual and neutral, suggesting miles and diversions in the many, many empty miles of mountain that have nothing. We led them to a stream where the fishing was supposed to be good, and suggested they turn back toward the logging road as the weather would make the ridge bad by evening. I won't lie and say it was noble. I won't lie about the way my hands trembled when I watched their truck leave. I will say that those moments were the ones that reminded me of how fragile what we carried was. One careless curiosity, and years could be ripped into headlines and cages. Maggie, for her part, continued to live a life that was split like a timberboard. She would be present in the town for medicine and to mend clothes, to collect the odd jobs that would keep her from being noticed as a curiosity. She volunteered at the library sometimes. She told children stories about the creek in a way that made their faces light up. Other nights, she would be on the mountain, braided hair catching light, the shadow of Enoch behind her like the echo of a myth turned gentle. We developed rituals. I would bring a can of coffee and a loaf of bread on certain nights and leave them at the mouth of the cave. She would show me where she'd found a patch of moss for a small cushion. She would show me how to pick a berry without damaging the plant. People began to talk about her in new and softer terms. She seems different, folks would say at the diner, and then adjust the subject to the weather. There were rumors, of course. Rumors are the surface of gossip. But no one asked the question that mattered, or rather no one asked it in a place where it would change anything. We protected Enoch by giving the town a story it could accept. Rescue. The rescue was not untrue. It simply left out the creature. There were nights that felt like punishment. I woke up one early morning to find my truck's tires flattened. Someone had left a note tucked under the wiper that read, "We all know where she was," signed by someone with no courage to put a name. The note smelled of beer and thin malice. I drove the truck to the mill, flat and hulking, and took the hits Frank gave me in silence. "You got troubles, Lester?" he asked. "You need to talk to someone." Later, in private, I told him I had been taking her to the clinic for follow-up care. He looked at me like a man trying to put pieces into a puzzle he didn't have instructions for. We didn't reconcile that evening. We didn't, in many ways, recover what had been between us. Secrets do that. They sever hands that once worked in the same rhythm. There was also a sweetness in the strain. Maggie was different in a way that made her closer and further all at the same time. She laughed more when she was on the mountain. She told me of the little ways Enoch had learned about human things, how he would watch wood being split and then sit and try to do it with a flat stone, striking a rhythm that later became useful for making kindling. She told me he liked the sound of the whistle I had carved and would put it under his chin, as if he were storing the sound in his bones. She told me the places he would go when he wandered, and that he had the map of the mountain in the way he trod. One night not long after the truck tires, there was a moment that sharpened everything into an either-or. Maggie had come down to town for some reason, library books, I think, and had a small disagreement with a neighbor over a borrowed ladder. Word of the argument spread like frost. The neighbor mentioned in the course of conversation that a friend of his had seen something large moving in the tree line up past the old firebreak. The neighbor told the sheriff, who told me in a voice that sounded like a bell, "We might have a person out there, Lester. Or it might be animals. Either way, we can't have people feeling unsafe." I went up that night because my life had become a rope strung between two worlds, and the tightness made my hands sweat. I climbed as I always had, slow and sure, and when I reached the cave mouth, the fire was a single obedient thing. Enoch watched me like a man does when he is trying to learn whether he is in the right company. I sat on my stump and breathed and watched the contours of his face in the lamplight. He turned his head and made the small, low sound like a question. Maggie reached for my hand. "You have to go and say something," she whispered. "Tell them they don't have to be afraid. Show them that he's not a threat." "Show them?" I said. "You want me to take him down to the town and have everyone stare at him like he's a prize? For what? For curiosity?" She looked at me like I had asked a cruel question. "Would you rather they drive a truck full of men with nets into the mountain? Because that's the other option." I understood then that the town's curiosity was not some abstract category. It was a hunger that would be kind if it could be kind, cruel if it had greed. If we revealed Enoch, the kindness would be wrapped in 1,000 hands that didn't know how to keep a thing safe. That was the cost that had to be weighed, that. So we did what we thought would cause the least harm. We stayed hidden. We took care. We told our half-truths. But no human compact lasts without friction. To keep Enoch safe, we had to accept that our own lives would be shaped by the secret. We had to accept that Maggie would be a bridge between two worlds, and that bridges wear down with traffic. Months turned into a pattern. I was the man who kept the ledger of the secret. I worked when I could and didn't when I couldn't. Sometimes I would come back from a night on the ridge and find Maggie had left a small thing on the stump, a length of twine, a carved tooth, a feather tied in a particular knot. Those things became our currency. They said, without speeches, that what we were doing had worth. There were moments of small grace that felt like repayment. One winter, the power went out in town for 2 days after an ice storm. People came into the diner and huddled. Someone mentioned that the old woman on Oak Street was too cold. I told Frank I could check her heater, and he nodded and handed me a tool. I drove my truck into town that day and worked like a man in service, setting a fan belt, oiling a door. I came home to a town that had not known I had been on the mountain the night before. That day I felt like a man who had earned a quiet. There were trade-offs like that. Loneliness traded for the right to hold a small mercy. We did not always get away with it. Once, a curious reporter came through on the trail of a different story and asked a dozen casual questions at the diner about missing persons. He had a charm that went slick under your skin and a smile designed to pry loose secrets. I felt the pull of his gaze, the way it sought contradictions. He asked after Maggie, and I told him what the town already said. She had been found after being lost. He wrote his notes and left. I never read what he wrote. Some stories are knives you don't need in your chest. The town, in its own way, adapted. The missing person posters came down. People stopped sitting at the bench outside the station every morning asking for updates. The sheriff bought a new pair of gloves and went about his duties. Life resumed in the small ways that towns do. Baseball on Saturdays, the annual fair, chili going cold beneath the chafing dish. Maggie would come into town sometimes and people would say, "Good to see you back," and mean it. They didn't press for details, because to press would be to risk being asked to make a choice about keeping someone safe. People in small places often preferred not to be forced into that kind of moral geometry. For me, the personal cost was heavier than I expected. I lost a woman I had been seeing off and on. Simple things like dates and time with her who couldn't understand why I'd keep disappearing for odd hours. She left with a soft patience that hardened into polite distance. "You can tell me when you're ready," she said when she left, and I watched the door close without the courage to chase. I became a man who valued solitude because solitude kept a secret. There was a point when the choice became more than secrecy. One spring, a logging company proposed opening a new road up onto a ridge not far from where the cave lay. It was the sort of plan that made men in suits rub their hands, and men like Tom scowl, because roads mean people, and people mean trouble. I knew the road's path from the maps in my glove box. I could see it trimming too close to the places Enoch liked to wander. If the road went in, the quiet we had would be compromised. Maggie was furious, then scared, and then resolved in a way that made me know we had to do something besides whisper. She came down to town and spoke to a councilman in a way I had never seen her speak. Calm, steady, with the kind of language that felt like a slow rope pulling a reluctant boat. "We need to reconsider that road," she told them. And she gave the sort of reasons that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with habitat and runoff and preserving the fragile lines where animals find water. The councilman listened, nodded, and produced a piece of paper that said development would be paused for feasibility. Whether it was her strong words or the city's own bureaucracy, I could not tell. The road plan stalled. That delay was a kind of victory. But it came at a cost that felt personal. Maggie took the lead in a community of people determined to slow the march of development. She became, in a quiet way, an advocate for the ridge, meeting with state people and petitioning with folks who loved the land. It was the kind of life that let her be close to Enoch without putting him at risk, and it suited her. She was, in some ways, more alive than before she disappeared. She had a purpose. But her life had also grown more public. The paradox tightened. I will confess something now that I didn't accept for some time. The choice to protect Enoch was not purely altruistic. There was a selfishness to it, a refusal to hand over the proof of something that had reconfigured my world. I liked being the man entrusted with a secret that mattered. The knowledge that no one else knew certain things made me feel important in a small human way. That's not noble. It's human, and it's the kind of admission that came at odd hours in the dark when the cave lay quiet, and Enoch's breath was the only movement you could hear. Time made the edges of our arrangement duller. Years, in fact, stretched and knit a rhythm. Maggie reappeared in town as a woman who had been through something no one else could name. She worked at the library, walked the creek sometimes with a basket of books, and volunteered for the conservation group. She remained the person who could be both intimate and distant. I remained the man who checked cairns and left food at the mouth of the cave. We made a system that felt like mercy. Dr. Chen continued to play her small role, discreet, legal-minded, and willing to sign off on reports that made Maggie's reintegration plausible. We did not promise quixotic things. We promised to keep quiet and to tend to the living things we had direct responsibility for. We did not accept fame or money. We did not allow merchandising or strange visitors. Still, the world kept threatening in small ways. Once, a college team came to the county looking for signs of unusual animal life. Their interest was academic, they said, but their questions were too detailed to be innocent. I met with them once and deflected. I fed them references to bogs and to woodpecker holes, and to the general geology of the ridge. It's ugly to admit how often I lied. But lying kept one creature from becoming a cage. There were times I thought I had done the wrong thing. I'd be in the diner and see a mother with a child pointing at a photo of Maggie on the missing board, though by then the posters had faded, and I would feel guilt like lead on my chest. I would sometimes think about what it meant to take a choice away from the community, and whether I had the right to do so for the sake of what I considered a dignity for another life. Once, in the grip of such doubt, I drove to the sheriff's office and placed my palm on the folder of Maggie's missing file on his desk. "Maybe I've been protecting the wrong thing," I said. Sheriff Tom looked at me like he had been waiting a long time to say something true. "You think you did wrong," he said. "Maybe. You think you did right. Maybe you did. Life's full of both. But listen to me, Lester. People decide for themselves what they will protect. Sometimes they protect things that ought not be. Sometimes they protect the thing that matters. You made a choice. Live with it like a man." He could have called me in for interrogation that day. He could have put a marker on my life in the town. He didn't. That was his way of being the man he wanted to be. It's the kind of kindness that creates debt and quiet complicity in equal measure. The most wrenching part of all this was not the secrecy, but the slow rearranging of human relationships. My mother never understood fully. She died some years into our arrangement, and I wasn't there at the bedside. I stayed on the mountain that day, and the decision to remain away felt like a betrayal, even as it felt like keeping a promise. She'd always understood Maggie's wanderings in a way I didn't. When she died, the town wrapped its arms around us in ways towns do: dishes, casseroles, quiet. But my absence at that time carved something that would not fully heal. Maggie would later write a letter I still have, folded in cedar, that said she forgave me in the small, blunt way siblings do. But the small regrets remain. The years go by. Enoch has aged in peculiar ways, slower than I expected, like a tree that thickens but holds its bark. He has scars that have mended and new ones that come from weather and from life. He's the sort of being that resists being made into a fable or a neat moral lesson. He just is. We continue to tend him and to let him tend us. People sometimes ask if we ever considered exposing him to scientists who might protect him in some official way. We did. There were nights when the idea burned like a fever. But all those plans, in the end, felt like arguments in favor of other people's curiosity. We weighed them and found them wanting. Is it worth it, this life of small protections and big omissions? I ask myself that often. I think of how people in town sometimes call my name like a weather report, and how Frank's eyes squinted when he saw me. I think of the patient ways Dr. Chen sat with her coffee, making room for the moral impossibility of our decision. I think of Maggie, who chose this life in part because it allowed her to be fully herself. I think of the nights we've shared a meal by the fire when the wind was a steady metronome outside the cave. I remember Enoch setting a stone between us like a small offering, as if to say, "I know you keep me. I know it's hard." As for the question that hovers, was it worth it? My answer is messier than a yes or no. There are things I've gained I could not have predicted. I gained a sense that some lives, however inconvenient to society's plans, deserve a kind of protection that isn't about display. I gained a closeness with my sister that is rawer and truer than anything before she left. I gained an understanding of how small acts, mending a wound, tying a knot, stacking a stone, can become the scaffolding of meaning. But I also lost simple comforts. I lost the neighborly small talk that used to fill my afternoons. I lost the easy ability to stand in the town square and tell a story without fear. I lost the woman I had started to love. I lost the tight, uncomplicated respect of some men I had known at the mill. I gained a secret, and it has required everything from me in way of time and stealth. Sometimes I wonder whether the mountain remembers us. There are moments when the wind seems to carry a sound that is older than language, and I feel, through the bones, the sense that the mountain is a custodian of strange pacts and private mercies. Maybe that's romantic. Maybe it's simply the way a man makes meaning of the world when he's been asked to keep a secret of such consequence. We still tend the cairns. Maggie and I refresh them, sometimes together, sometimes apart. The stones are a language, a map, a way of telling someone you care enough to mark a path and no more. I imagine strangers will continue to ask the mountain its questions. Some will find answers, others will find only the way the forest keeps its counsel. Enoch walks his paths and remembers rain. People ask if I'll ever tell the whole story. I don't know that there's a whole story that can be told. Some truths, once exposed, don't survive in the hands that clutch at them. There are kinds of revelation that come with glare and cages and men who have no patience for dignity. If I ever do tell it, if the time comes, I will tell it not as proof of the impossible, but as an account of what one man, and later a small group, chose to protect between the mountain and the plain. For now, I live in the way my mother used to say grace, with gratitude and with a bitter acknowledgement. I am the man who was searching for his missing sister. I am also the man who found her living with someone the world calls impossible. We have made a life that is both tender and flawed. We have drawn lines that some would call cowardly, and others would call merciful. I sleep sometimes and dream of a town that knows everything, and another where secrets keep the quiet alive. If you're sitting there wondering what you would do in my boots, whether you would shout it to the rooftops or tuck it under your shirt like a stone, there's no simple answer. All I can tell you is what I chose. I chose the preservation of a life over the indulgence of curiosity. I chose to keep my sister's choice sacred, even though that choice cost me many ordinary things. I chose, in my own clumsy way, to be the bone of defense between a strange intelligence and a world that does not always know how to be gentle. If this story made you question what you'd protect, consider sharing it with someone who likes long, strange stories. If you want more like this, stories about people who make hard choices in the quiet, subscribe and come back. There are more mountains to walk and more cairns to follow.